Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and we welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we welcome back a friend of Cultural Caravan, Dr. Gerald Horne. He is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He has published more than 30 books, topics such as White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela, as well as The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery and White Supremacy, and the Capitalism in the 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. Let's welcome Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne, welcome to Cultural Caravan. Welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's first start with, how would you define critical race theory for our audience?
Well, critical race theories, interestingly enough, arises in law schools. A figure that has been associated with CRT, critical race theory, is the late Derek Bell of Harvard Law School, who happened to be a mentor of Barack Obama, the former US president. It arose in law schools, I believe, and I say this as a person who once practiced law, and in a sense was part of the movement that led to CRT, is that it was an attempt to try to explain phenomena. For example, supposedly the law is neutral, and yet we know that a disproportionate percentage of those found on death row happen to be Black men. We know that Black people are disproportionately incarcerated. The United States may have the largest number of people behind bars of any nation on planet Earth. And so CRT is arising to explain what might be called systemic racism. That is to say, racism wherein you're not necessarily looking at the good or bad wishes of individuals. You're looking at the barrel. In other words, you're not looking for that one rotten apple supposedly in the barrel. You're looking at the barrel itself and saying and trying to ascertain how the barrel itself might be structuring social relations that lead to these white supremacist outcomes and these anti-Black outcomes and these racist outcomes. Now, unsurprisingly, perhaps, as the United States has turned to the right, particularly after the 2016 election of one Donald J. Trump, you've had objection to this idea that there might be something wrong with the United States of America, because according to the critics of CRT, this is the greatest nation that was ever created. It's the greatest nation on planet Earth. And here you have these individuals coming along talking about systemic racism, pointing to what they see as a deep and pervasive and profound flaw embedded in the culture and politics and societies and economics of this country. So what's happened is that the right wing, the conservatives, have turned CRT into a kind of punching bag. You might recall a few months ago, you had the gubernatorial election in the state of Virginia, and the winning Republican candidate, Glenn Youngkin, turned a novel by the late Nobel laureate Toni Morrison into a campaign issue. That is to say, her novel Beloved, which, as you know, deals with slavery, because supposedly one of his constituents was complaining that that book was assigned in school and it left little Johnny, her son, quite mortified, quite upset. And this has led, as you know, to legislation in a number of states seeking to circumscribe CRT. Now, from what I've just told you briefly, you may be wondering, well, CRT comes out of law schools. So why are parents in K through 12 with K through 12 kids complaining? Well, that's a very good question, because of course, CRT is not part of the curriculum of K through 12. Indeed, most of these legislators who are complaining about it probably cannot define CRT and wouldn't know it if CRT if it smacked them in the face. But it's deeper than CRT, because also part of this discourse is the 1619 Project of the New York Times and its architect, Nicole Hannah-Jones, now of Howard University. You may recall that in August 2019, the New York Times Magazine had a special issue devoted to slavery and the consequences of slavery. The 1619 Project posits that many of the problems you see today are a direct outgrowth of unresolved issues involving slavery. Now, technically, the 1619 Project is not part of CRT, but I'm sure you can imagine, you can infer why there are those who think that it is part of CRT, because once again, it's trying to tease out a systemic analysis of this question of white supremacy and slavery, positing that its roots stretch back centuries, for example. Likewise, there's been an attempt to make sure that the 1619 Project is not taught in schools in the United States. It's been legislated against. So this is a very striking moment in which we find ourselves. And your audience should know that I'm not necessarily a neutral observer, because as you suggested in your opening comments, a good deal of the histories that I write go against the grain. They tend to try to overturn a very comfortable mythologies. And so I'm watching this, I must say, with more than a spectator's interest.
Definitely, and certainly I appreciate what you said. And what I look at it also as an educator is, I think there's a backlash. I think that, as you know, there's been over the years, our people, scholars like yourself and others, have started to question the American story and ask, where does the African story, the impact of African Americans beyond just being enslaved, what did we do? What was our impact, getting our voice, as well as others, and who also who are now, in addition to us, wanting to get a voice. And I think as we started to question, and particularly people started to question the fact that we have former slave owners who have statues all over the country, and these statues were being pulled down all over the place, people started to get upset. Why is it that this racist or that racist, this slaveholder is now being, that their children, we talked about off camera about the fact that there's certain institutions in the society, such as Colonial Williamsburg, which, tells the American story, that basically tells that, the early American history story that people like to tell their children about some of these great people. But we know that our history in America, there's the beauties, but there's the uglies. And I think that's where their parents, particularly other parents outside of our community, who say, do they want their children to know that ugly side? The fact that their ancestors or people were brutal slaveholders, or some of the brutality. So I think that's where we're starting to get the pushback. People do not want their children to realize. And I guess this is more of a psychological thing, dealing with how do people deal with the truth? I mean, your work, when you dealt with several of your works that you've discussed, talking about why the American Revolution was fought. Okay. Many of us thought that it was a, very pious thing. We were fighting against the British, these terrible Brits, only to find out through, some of the counter-revolution of 1776, that slave resistance and the origin of the United States really uncovers that other truth that nobody wants to talk about. And why? Because we've been taught that one group was the terrible. So I'm saying all this to say, how, as we start, and of course we have to understand, parents are parents. What can we do now that we're going to now have legislators who say no CRT? We don't want books such as your books that talk about against the America, that's being glorified. When I go to certain, citadels of American history, what do you do, particularly as an educator? How do we protect our ancestors fought against in terms of during the civil rights movement, in terms of being respected as a human being? How do we protect these outcomes so that our children and others learn true American history?
Well, I think it'll have to be a two-front struggle. The first front is organizing through parent-teacher associations, PTAs, organizing alongside the Teachers Union, the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers are two of the most powerful and influential unions in this country. They are part of a larger labor movement. We need to light a fire under these teachers' unions and to get them involved, because first they say you can't teach ABC about history. Next, they'll be more explicit, saying that you cannot teach with regard to male supremacy, for example, or you cannot teach with regard to women's history, for example. That is to say, with this battle to liquidate CRT, as the saying goes, the camel's nose is in the tent. And if we're not careful, the camel will enter the tent and trample all those who are there. So we really need to conduct a mass struggle in conjunction with teachers' unions. And then secondly, we need parents to take it upon themselves to make sure that their children have a library card, for example, and that their children are downloading books onto a laptop or to a Kindle, or going to the library to take out books and monitoring their learning. Likewise, we need like-minded parents to band together to have Saturday classes that specialize in Black history, for example. As you know, many groups in this country, they send their children to public schools Monday through Friday, and then on Saturday, they expose their children to the specificities of the culture from which they emerge. And there is some of that with regard to the Black community, but certainly we need more. And I think that this two-front struggle has to be waged, because our opponents are deadly serious, with the accent on deadly. They are objecting to telling an accurate story about slavery. They are objecting to telling an accurate story about US apartheid or Jim Crow. And if our kids, if our children are subjected to this noxious propaganda, they will grow up not knowing who they are. They will grow up being more susceptible to being influenced by all manner of noxious propaganda. In other words, I think that a central aspect of parenting has to be monitoring very carefully of what our children are being taught. Because to take that example from the state of Virginia, the folks on the other side of the barricades, that's what they're doing. They're saying, we don't want little Jennifer and little Johnny to learn about slavery. And they got this governor elected who's going to try to effectuate their demented wishes. So obviously we need to push back. Otherwise, we might find ourselves in more dire circumstances and straits than we now find ourselves.
I think the main thing is that people understand it's not just teaching. I think that teaching our children the true American history, but also that we also realize that white children have not been taught the true story. And unfortunately, because their parents are very concerned about what that story, maybe the perception of that their children may have of themselves, they're worried too, that, if I talk, if you're going to talk about all the uglies and the terrible things they did to African Americans, then maybe the self-esteem of their children, they may feel might be, or of them, So I think there's a psychological aspect of this that, when we talk about how do we ensure that our children learn the truth, but also the children of others? European children deserve a true history. Asian, all children who go, everybody deserves that history. And how do we protect that? And certainly, I think there needs to also, and this is just something I just want to get your flow on this, a way to, how do we deal with the fact that there are people who fear, like we say, we know this, there's fear about people, children knowing that truth. How do we deal with that? Because that's really, to me, what's pushing this backlash. Okay, so how do we deal with that?
Well, I remember during the bad old days of Jim Crow, this gray in my hair is not dye. I mean, it arose, shall we say, naturally. And I recall the objection to Jim Crow legislation, which was that, well, you really can't change people's hearts and minds. But as we said at the time, we're trying to change the law. And if we change the law, their hearts and minds will follow. And even if their hearts and minds don't follow, we're still going to change the law. And that's my response to those folks who say that they fear the truth. Well, they can go on fearing the truth as long as the truth is taught in the classroom. If they want to go home and dream about denying the truth, well, fine, dream on. But in the classroom, we're going to make sure that the truth is taught. Likewise, we're going to make sure the truth is reflected in textbooks. Once again, if you don't like the truth, well, okay, fine. And if you want to write down lies on your final exam, well, maybe you'll flunk. Tough, but we're going to push forward with the truth. We're going to push forward with the truth in the classroom, the truth in the textbooks, because we cannot afford to have a generation of youth in this world in which we now find ourselves, which is so competitive and so perilous at the same time. We cannot afford to disadvantage our youth by feeding them propaganda, by feeding them lies, by feeding them anything that's going to take them off the straight and narrow.
And you're actually right, absolutely right about this. And certainly, as the other party chooses the politics, and it's really going to have to go into political. How do we protect? We're going to have to get legislation, just like we get legislation, civil rights. All children have a civil right to get accurate education, because right now they're also challenging the colleges too. You know, it's not just, it's starting with the K to 12, but it's ultimately going to be where professors will say, and I know this is not the first time, oh, you can't have that book in there. That book challenges, because where do teachers have to get an education and so forth. So I think this is something that impacts us all, and how we can get our legislators to protect the rights of people like yourself who are producing material to educate, so that books are not banned from the schoolrooms nor the college campuses that question America, you know, and that's something which I think is a big question that we have to look at, how this particular movement might impact our children's ability to get information, and other children get an opportunity to get information. So that's why you know, this topic is one I think needs to be taken on several different fronts. But right now, as it relates to, and I know you work with academia, what's going on in academia around this topic in terms of other professors, in terms of, have you felt challenged, or other your colleagues challenged in terms of teaching the truth versus dealing with what's going on out there? I'm just curious on that.
Well, I must say that I've been on leave since 2020 because of the pandemic. So I haven't had that much contact with the campus at the University of Houston. Before that, I can't recall receiving that much pushback. There are probably some episodes I might have forgotten about, but I can't say it's been a dominant trend. Now, certainly with regard to the books that I write, they get a lot of pushback. oftentimes unfairly. But I mean, that's par for the course. I mean, as they say, sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words rarely harm me. And so I can deal with the pushbacks, the unfair criticisms with regard to what I write, because since I'm a historian, I recognize that it wasn't not so long ago that if you tried to say what I write as a Black person, you might wind up hanging from the nearest tree. So given that standard, unfair words in a review of one of my books, I have to say that, as the saying goes, you sort of brush it off and move on.
Well, in line with that, you mentioned Houston and Texas. As you know, Texas is one of those states that's really become very, very vocal about their changing the curriculum, removing aspects. So what do you think about that? Where, you know, they've actually started something that could actually start reverberating and it's trickling around in terms of people actually deciding, oh, I'm not going to teach about enslavement. I'm not going to teach about this or that, anything that's critical to the American story. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, because despite my words a second or two ago, obviously in Texas, you always have to be on guard. That is to say, once I determined to go back into the classroom after this pandemic eases, it would not surprise me at all, given this changing political climate, that the kind of pushback that I receive migrates from how my books are reviewed to what I say in the classroom. And I say this particularly since we know that Texas has been in the vanguard of trying to tell an ill-advised story of the history of the United States, particularly downplaying slavery. So far, that's been mostly K through 12, kindergarten through 12. But I doubt if it'll just stay there. Inevitably, it seems to me it'll migrate to the college ranks. But once again, it'll involve a struggle. And as a Black person who comes from a heritage and tradition of struggle, I would say that this is really nothing new.
Well, you know, Dr. Horne, I really appreciate you joining us with this conversation. And again, it's an ongoing saga as we start to deal with the impact of very conservative legislators coming into the ranks and making changes as it relates to our history, and us basically exercising our civil right to get an accurate portrayal of our story for our children. And this will continue, and we certainly will have you back to talk about it as it involves. But I just want to, first of all, thank you so much for joining us, because every time, and we continue to have some great information or feedback from the audience as they start to really listen and digest the information that you pack in. So just know you have a strong chorus of support. That people want to know the truth, regardless of who they are. Most people who like the truth, regardless. So I want you to, on behalf of Cultural Caravan, salute your work, your scholarship, your commitment to telling the American story in its totality, because that's basically what it is, telling the American story in its totality and ensuring that people of color, people of consciousness are a part of that story. So we want to sincerely thank you for joining us. Thank you for your work. I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, or to tell a friend. But please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you. Let's welcome Joe Patan.
They jumping in the city, West Indian happy, happy whole time for Labor Day. I tell you, no problem, for we take over Harlem Sunday, eve of Labor Day. Virgin Islands crew in town, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. When you hear the cowbell ring, Harlem will be jumping. Hey, hey, Carnival, hey, hey, Bacchanal, hey, hey, Carnival, oh yeah. Virgin Islands in town for Labor Day. The action will be heavy. People from the